The blood on Faith Warren's hands wouldn't wash away, no matter how vigorously she scrubbed them in the icy creek water. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt and blood that stained her once fine blue dress. She had been running for 2 days now, her feet blistered and raw inside boots never meant for such punishment. The water soothed her skin but did nothing for the pain that ripped through her heart. Faith glanced nervously over her shoulder, certain that at any moment Sheriff Blackwood and his men would appear from between the cottonwoods. She didn't regret what she'd done, only that she hadn't done it sooner, before her father's life had been snuffed out by Harrison Blackwood's greed. The setting sun cast long shadows across the narrow creek bed as Faith huddled against a large boulder, trying to make herself invisible. Wyoming Territory in 1878 was no place for a woman alone, but she had nowhere else to go. Her entire life had been the small ranch her father had built from nothing, the ranch that now lay in ashes behind her. A sob escaped her lips, and she quickly pressed her hand against her mouth. Faith had always prided herself on her strength, but now she felt like a hollow shell. Her father was dead, her home destroyed, and she was wanted for murder. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd killed the man who had murdered her father, yet she was the one being hunted. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her blood run cold. Faith pressed herself tighter against the boulder, willing her body to disappear into the stone. The horse and rider came to a stop on the ridge above the creek, and she held her breath. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "I know someone's down there." Faith remained silent, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give her away. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man continued. "Just heard crying is all." The mare snorted and pawed at the ground as the stranger dismounted. Faith could hear his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way down to the creek. She closed her eyes, pressing herself further against the rock, praying for invisibility. "Madam," the voice was closer now, gentle but firm, "are you hurt?" Faith opened her eyes to find a tall man standing a respectful distance away. His face was partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see kind eyes studying her with concern. He wore simple clothes, worn denim, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. The gun holstered at his side looked well used but not worn for show like the men who had worked for Blackwood. "Go away," Faith whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please." The stranger took a step closer, then stopped when Faith flinched. "My name's Matthew Collins. I've got a small spread about 3 miles from here." He gestured vaguely to the west. "Can't in good conscience leave a lady crying alone by a creek when night's coming on." "You don't understand," Faith said, her voice breaking. "They're looking for me." "If they find you helping me, they'll—" "Who's looking for you?" Matthew asked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his gun. Faith looked down at her blood-stained dress and trembling hands. "Sheriff Blackwood and his men. I killed his brother." She expected him to back away, to leave her to her fate, but instead a strange expression crossed his face. "Harrison Blackwood's brother," Matthew clarified, his voice suddenly tight. Faith nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "He killed my father, burned our ranch. I had no choice." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then, with a decisive nod, he extended his hand. "Come with me." Faith stared at his outstretched hand in disbelief. "Did you hear what I said? I'm wanted for murder." "I heard." His hand remained steady. "And I also know the Blackwoods. Their kind of justice isn't something I'd wish on anyone, guilty or innocent." His eyes softened. "Let me help you, miss." "Faith," she supplied cautiously. "Faith Warren." "Miss Warren," Matthew continued, "night's falling fast and this creek bed isn't safe. My ranch isn't much, but it's secure. You'll have food, shelter, and time to figure out your next move." His expression turned grim. "If Blackwood's men are searching, they'll find you here by morning." Faith knew he was right. She had nowhere else to go, no plan beyond running. With a shaky breath, she placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. Matthew nodded approvingly and shrugged off his coat, draping it around her shoulders. "It'll be cold riding at night," he explained, deliberately looking away from her blood-stained dress. He led her up the embankment to where his horse waited, a magnificent chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Penny," Matthew said, patting the horse's neck. "She's strong enough to carry us both until we're home." Faith hesitated before the large animal. I've never ridden before." Matthew's eyebrows rose in surprise. "A rancher's daughter who's never ridden—" "Pa was protective," Faith explained, the memory bringing fresh pain. "He'd never let me near the horses, said they were too dangerous for his little girl." Her voice caught on the last words. Matthew's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your father, Miss Warren." He cleared his throat. "Now I'll help you up and then I'll mount behind you. All you need to do is hold onto the saddle horn." With surprising gentleness for his size, Matthew lifted Faith onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a warm barrier between her and the encroaching night. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then they were moving, Penny's gait smooth and sure even in the growing darkness. Faith sat rigid at first, uncomfortable with the proximity to this stranger. But as exhaustion and the rhythmic motion of the horse took hold, she found herself leaning back against Matthew's solid chest. His heartbeat was steady and strong against her back, a stark contrast to her own racing pulse. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they rode through a moonlit stretch of prairie. Matthew was silent for so long that Faith thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with an old pain. 4 years ago, Edward Blackwood decided he wanted my family's land. When my father refused to sell, accidents started happening. Cattle mysteriously died, fences were cut, our well was poisoned. His arms tightened around the reins. Then one night our barn caught fire, my parents died trying to save the horses. Faith turned slightly to look up at him. "I'm sorry." Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. "Sheriff Blackwood ruled it an accident, despite witness accounts of his brother being seen near our property that night." He exhaled slowly. "So when you say you killed a Blackwood because he murdered your father, Miss Warren, I believe you. And I'm inclined to think justice has been served, even if the law doesn't see it that way." They rode in silence after that, each lost in their memories of loss and injustice. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light over the rolling Wyoming landscape. Faith found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, the events of the past few days finally taking their toll. She was barely awake when Matthew announced, "We're home." Through heavy-lidded eyes, Faith saw a small but well-maintained cabin come into view. A corral stood to one side, currently empty, and a modest barn was positioned behind the main house. It wasn't large, but in the moonlight it looked like sanctuary. Matthew dismounted first, then reached up to help Faith down. Her legs buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he caught her with strong hands. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe now." Faith wasn't sure she believed him, wasn't sure she'd ever feel safe again, but she allowed him to guide her toward the cabin while Penny followed obediently behind. "Wait here a moment," Matthew said, helping Faith settle on a bench by the door. He quickly led Penny to the barn, returning minutes later to find Faith struggling to stay awake. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. Faith was too exhausted to protest as he carried her inside and gently deposited her on a bed in a small room off the main living area. "Rest now," Matthew said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "We'll talk more in the morning." Faith wanted to thank him, to ask more questions, but exhaustion claimed her before she could form the words. The last thing she remembered was Matthew's concerned face as he pulled a quilt over her, and then blessed darkness. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the smell of coffee. Faith's eyes fluttered open, momentary confusion giving way to the crushing memory of everything that had happened. She sat up with a gasp, her heart racing as she took in her surroundings. The room was small but tidy, with simple furnishings: the bed she occupied, a wooden chest, a small table with a basin and pitcher, and a hook on the wall where a woman's dress hung. Faith blinked at the garment, then looked down at herself, realizing she was still wearing her blood-stained blue dress beneath the quilt. A soft knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Warren," Matthew's voice called, "are you awake?" "Yes," she replied, pulling the quilt up to her chin despite being fully clothed. The door opened slightly, but Matthew remained in the hallway. I've got breakfast ready when you are, and I found some clothes that might fit you. They belonged to my sister-in-law before she and my brother moved to California. Faith glanced at the dress hanging on the wall. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Matthew, he corrected gently. There's water in the pitcher for washing up. Take your time. The door closed and Faith heard his footsteps retreat. She sat still for a moment, overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. With a deep breath, she pushed back the quilt and forced herself to stand. Her body ached, her feet throbbed, but she was alive and for the first time in days, not immediately running for her life. Faith poured water into the basin and scrubbed her face and hands, watching as the water turned pink with the blood she hadn't been able to wash away in the creek. She changed into the offered dress, a simple brown calico that was slightly too large but clean and whole. There was even a hairbrush on the table, which she used to tame her tangled auburn hair before braiding it simply. When she finally emerged from the room, Faith found Matthew at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast iron skillet. The cabin's main room was larger than she expected, with a sturdy table, a few chairs, a small sofa near the fireplace, and shelves lined with books, more books than Faith had ever seen outside the schoolhouse. You have quite a library, she observed softly. Matthew turned, a smile warming his features as he took in her transformed appearance. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. Reading was sacred in our household. He gestured to the table, which was already set for two. Please sit, the eggs are nearly ready. Faith sat down, feeling strangely shy now that she was clean and rested. In the daylight, she could see Matthew more clearly. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His face was tanned from working outdoors, with laugh lines around his eyes despite the serious set of his mouth. He brought over 2 plates of fried eggs and bacon, then returned to the stove for a pot of coffee and a basket of biscuits. It was a simple meal, but to Faith, who hadn't eaten properly in days, it looked like a feast. Thank you, she said sincerely. For everything? Matthew nodded, taking the seat across from her. You're welcome, Miss Warren. Faith, she corrected, echoing his words from earlier. Please call me Faith. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Faith trying not to show how ravenous she was. When she'd taken the edge off her hunger, she looked up to find Matthew watching her with a thoughtful expression. What will you do now? He asked quietly. Faith set down her fork, the question piercing through her momentary comfort. I don't know, she admitted. I can't go back. Sheriff Blackwood will see me hanged for what I did. Did anyone see you? Matthew pressed. Anyone besides the Blackwood's men? Faith shook her head. No. It was just Edward and 2 of his men. Her voice broke and she took a deep breath before continuing. They just shot my father, said he should have sold the ranch when he had the chance. Edward laughed while my father bled out. Her hands clenched into fists on the table. I grabbed Pa's shotgun from behind the door. Edward didn't even see me until I pulled the trigger. Matthew reached across the table and gently placed his hand over her fist. You did what you had to do. Faith looked up, meeting his gaze. His men saw me. They fired at me as I ran, but I made it to the trees. I heard them say they were going to tell the sheriff I murdered Edward in cold blood. Of course they would, Matthew said grimly, withdrawing his hand. That's how the Blackwoods operate. They twist everything to suit their purposes. He stood and walked to the window, looking out across his property. They've been buying up or driving out smaller ranchers for years, building an empire on stolen land and broken lives. Why hasn't anyone stopped them? Faith asked. Matthew turned back to her, his expression hard. Sheriff Blackwood makes sure complaints disappear, and those who push too hard tend to have unfortunate accidents. His voice softened as he added, like our parents. Faith felt a chill run through her. Then I really have nowhere to go. You can stay here, Matthew said firmly. At least until we figure something out. I can't ask that of you, Faith protested. You've already risked enough by taking me in. You didn't ask, I offered. Matthew sat back down, his expression resolute. The Blackwoods have taken enough from both of us. I won't let them take your life too. Faith wanted to argue to tell him he was being foolish, but the determination in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Matthew said with a grim smile. "Sheriff Blackwood's men will be searching every homestead in the territory. We need to be prepared." "What can we do?" Faith asked. Matthew considered this. "First, we need a story in case anyone comes asking. You're my cousin from back east, come to help after hearing about my parents' passing." Faith nodded, committing the lie to memory. "And if they recognize me?" "They won't," Matthew said confidently. "Your wanted poster will describe a blood-covered woman with wild hair, not a respectable young lady in a brown calico dress." He paused, studying her face. "Though those green eyes of yours are distinctive, we should keep you inside if riders approach." The mention of her eyes made Faith blush inexplicably. She looked down at her plate, unsure how to respond to the observation that seemed almost like a compliment. "What about your neighbors?" she asked, changing the subject. "Won't they find it strange that you suddenly have a cousin staying with you?" "My nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and we mind our own business out here," Matthew explained. "But just to be safe, I'll ride over to the Hendersons' place today and introduce the story." "Martha Henderson's the biggest gossip in 3 counties. If she believes you're my cousin, everyone will." Faith looked around the small cabin, suddenly aware of the impropriety of her situation. "It's not proper for me to stay here alone with you," she said quietly. "People will talk." Matthew's expression softened with understanding. "You're right, which is why my cousin is staying in my brother's old room while I take the bunkhouse out back." He gestured toward a door Faith hadn't noticed. "I moved my things out there this morning while you were sleeping." Faith felt both relieved and strangely disappointed by this arrangement. "You've thought of everything?" "Not everything," Matthew admitted, "but I'm trying." He stood and began clearing the table. "Rest today. Tomorrow we can talk about how you might help around the ranch if you're feeling up to it." "I want to help," Faith said quickly. "I'm not afraid of hard work." A genuine smile spread across Matthew's face, the first she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, making him look younger and impossibly handsome. "I believe you, Faith Warren, I believe you." For the first time since her father's death, Faith felt a flicker of hope. She might be broken, she might be hunted, but she wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed settled into an unexpected rhythm. Faith threw herself into learning the workings of Matthew's modest ranch. Though her father had owned a larger spread, he had never allowed Faith to participate in the daily operations, insisting that a lady shouldn't concern herself with such matters. Now, under Matthew's patient guidance, she discovered a natural affinity for ranch work. She learned to collect eggs without antagonizing the hens, to milk the cow without getting kicked, and even to tend the vegetable garden that had clearly been neglected for some time. Inside the cabin, Faith took charge of cooking and cleaning, finding comfort in the domestic tasks her mother had taught her before succumbing to fever when Faith was 14. Matthew noticed the changes she brought to his home but said little about them directly. Still, Faith caught him looking around in wonder at the freshly swept floors, the curtains she'd mended, and the more elaborate meals that had replaced his basic fare. One evening, about 2 weeks after Faith's arrival, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Faith was darning one of Matthew's socks while he whittled a piece of wood with skilled hands. "You don't have to do that," Matthew said, nodding at the sock in her hands. Faith smiled. "I don't mind, it's peaceful." She finished a neat stitch before adding, "Besides, you can't keep wearing socks with holes the size of silver dollars." Matthew chuckled, the sound warming Faith more than the spring evening warranted. "I managed just fine before you came along. Did you?" Faith teased, gaining confidence in their growing friendship. "Your socks and shirts tell a different story." Matthew set down his whittling and looked at her directly. "My home's been different since you arrived, Faith." "Better." The simple honesty in his voice made Faith's cheeks flush. She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to the compliment that felt weighted with something more. "I've been wondering," Matthew continued when Faith remained silent, "about your plans." Faith's hands stilled. "My plans?" You've been here 2 weeks now, Matthew said carefully. Not that I'm complaining, far from it, but I've been thinking about your situation. Have you heard something? Faith asked, her voice tight with sudden fear. About the sheriff, Matthew shook his head quickly. No, nothing like that, but I did hear from Tom Henderson that the Blackwoods have been asking about strangers in the area. They haven't come this far west yet, but they might. Faith set the darning aside, her hands trembling slightly. Then I should go. I've put you at risk long enough. That's not what I'm saying, Matthew replied firmly. I'm saying we need a more permanent solution than hiding you away like a secret. What kind of solution? Faith asked cautiously. Matthew hesitated, then said, There's a judge coming through Preston next week. Judge Hamilton. He's known for standing up to the Blackwoods when he can. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. If we could get your story to him, with witnesses to back up the Blackwoods' pattern of intimidation and violence, he might be able to help. Hope and fear warred within Faith. Witnesses? Who would testify against the Blackwoods? More people than you might think, Matthew said. The Hendersons lost land to them, so did the Jacobsons and the Reeves family. There are others who have been threatened or strong-armed. He reached out and gently took Faith's hand. You're not the only victim, Faith, just the first to fight back. Faith looked down at their joined hands, drawing strength from his touch. What if it doesn't work? What if the judge believes Sheriff Blackwood instead? Then we'll find another way, Matthew promised. I won't let them hurt you, Faith, not while I have breath in my body. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Faith look up sharply. In the fading light, Matthew's expression was intense, his eyes reflecting emotions that made her heart beat faster. Without thinking, Faith squeezed his hand. Why? She whispered. Why risk everything for me? You barely know me. Matthew was quiet for a moment, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. At first, it was because we shared a common enemy, he admitted. But now, he paused, seeming to search for the right words. Now it's because I've come to care about what happens to you, Faith Warren. Faith felt her breath catch. She had grown to care for Matthew too far more than was wise given her circumstances. But hearing him voice similar feelings made her both elated and terrified. I care about you too, she confessed softly, and that's why I can't let you put yourself in danger for me. Matthew started to respond when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. He quickly released Faith's hand and stood. Get inside, he ordered quietly. Stay in your room until I come for you. Faith didn't argue. She gathered her darning and hurried into the cabin, heart pounding as she closed the bedroom door behind her. Through the small window, she could see Matthew standing calmly on the porch, one hand resting casually near his holstered gun as two riders approached. Even from a distance, Faith recognized Sheriff Blackwood's distinctive white hat. The other rider was one of the men who had been with Edward when he'd murdered her father. Cold fear washed over her, and she shrank back from the window, praying they hadn't seen her. Faith could hear the muffled voices of the men as they spoke to Matthew, though she couldn't make out the words. The conversation seemed to go on forever, each minute stretching her nerves tighter. Finally, she heard the hoofbeats receding and cautiously peeked out the window to see the two men riding away. She waited, barely breathing, until Matthew appeared at her door. His face was grim. They're looking for you, he confirmed. Said a murderess might be hiding in these parts, a woman who killed Edward Blackwood in cold blood while he was conducting legitimate business. Faith felt sick. What did you tell them? That I hadn't seen any strange women, but I'd keep an eye out. Matthew's jaw tightened. They asked about my cousin too, said they'd heard I had a visitor. Martha Henderson, Faith guessed. Matthew nodded. I told them my cousin from back east was staying with me for a spell, helping out after hearing about my parents. His expression darkened. Blackwood gave me a look I didn't like, said he might come back to make a proper introduction to the lady of the house. Fear curled in Faith's stomach. He suspects something, Matthew agreed, but he has no proof, not yet. He ran a hand through his hair, thinking. This changes things. We need to move faster than I thought. What do you mean? Faith asked. The judge won't be in Preston for another 5 days, Matthew explained. That's too long to wait with Blackwood sniffing around. I think we need to go to him instead. Go where? Judge Hamilton is in Cheyenne now, according to what I heard in town last week. Matthew's expression was determined. If we leave tonight, we can be there in 2 days. Faith shook her head. It's too dangerous. The roads will be watched. Not if we don't take the roads, Matthew countered. I know these lands better than most, including back trails the Blackwood's men won't know to watch. Faith could see the resolve in his eyes and knew arguing would be futile. When do we leave? As soon as it's fully dark, Matthew said. Pack only what you need. We'll travel light and fast. Faith nodded, her mind already cataloging the few possessions she'd accumulated during her stay. What about your ranch, your animals? Matthew's expression softened at her concern. I'll ride over to the Hendersons after nightfall. Tom owes me a favor. He'll look after things until we return. And if we don't return? Faith asked quietly. Matthew stepped closer, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. We will, he promised. One way or another, we'll come back to this place, together. The certainty in his voice made Faith want to believe him, despite the odds stacked against them. She looked up into his face, this man who had taken in a stranger, protected her, and now was risking everything to help her find justice. Without thinking, Faith rose on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered against his skin. Matthew went still, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. When she pulled back, his eyes were darker, more intense than she'd ever seen them. For a breathless moment, Faith thought he might kiss her properly and realized with a jolt that she wanted him to. Instead, Matthew cleared his throat and stepped back. We should prepare, he said, his voice rougher than usual. It's going to be a long night. Faith nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment. I'll be ready. The darkness was complete when they finally set out, the new moon offering no light to guide their way. Matthew led them on horseback, Faith riding Penny, while Matthew rode a sturdy gelding named Samson. They traveled in silence, with Matthew occasionally pointing out obstacles or changes in direction with a touch on Faith's arm. Faith was grateful for the lessons in riding Matthew had given her over the past 2 weeks. Though she was far from expert, she could at least stay on Penny's back without clutching the saddle horn in terror. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and stretch their cramped muscles. By dawn, they had covered significant ground, putting miles between themselves and the Blackwood's immediate territory. Matthew led them to a small, hidden canyon where a spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a tiny oasis. We'll rest here for a few hours, he said as he helped Faith dismount. Get some sleep if you can. We'll move again at midday. Faith was too exhausted to argue. She curled up on the bedroll Matthew laid out for her beneath an overhang of rock and fell immediately into a deep sleep. When she woke, the sun was high overhead, and Matthew was nowhere to be seen. Panic flared briefly until she noticed Samson and Penny still tethered nearby, grazing contentedly on the sparse vegetation. Faith sat up, stretching her sore muscles, and only then spotted Matthew returning to the camp, a brace of rabbits in his hand. Hope you're hungry, he said with a smile that made her heart skip. Thought we could use a hot meal before continuing. Starving, Faith admitted, returning his smile. Can I help? Together they prepared a simple meal, working in comfortable tandem as if they'd been doing so for years rather than weeks. Faith found herself watching Matthew's hands as he skillfully butchered the rabbits and built a small, nearly smokeless fire. They were good hands, strong and capable, yet gentle when they needed to be. They ate quickly, aware of the need to keep moving, but the brief respite had restored Faith's energy and optimism. As they packed up their meager camp, she asked, "How much farther to Cheyenne?" "If we keep this pace, we should reach the outskirts by tomorrow evening," Matthew replied. "Judge Hamilton is staying at the Cheyenne Hotel, according to what I heard." Faith nodded, then hesitated before asking, "What will happen when we get there? To me, I mean." Matthew paused in his packing, giving the question serious consideration. "Best case, the judge hears your story along with testimony about the Blackwood's other misdeeds and dismisses the charges against you. And worst case," Faith pressed. Matthew's expression turned grim. "Worst case, he doesn't believe us and you stand trial for murder." Faith swallowed hard. "And if that happens?" "It won't," Matthew said with fierce certainty, "but if it did, I wouldn't let you face it alone." He finished securing his saddlebag and turned to her fully. "I meant what I said last night, Faith. We'll get through this together." Faith wanted desperately to believe him. In the bright light of day, his determination seemed enough to overcome any obstacle. She nodded, forcing a brave smile. Together. They mounted up and continued their journey, following game trails and natural pathways that wound through the rugged Wyoming landscape. Matthew kept them away from main roads and settlements, taking a more circuitous route that added miles but kept them hidden from potential searchers. As the sun began to set on their second day of travel, Faith spotted smoke rising in the distance. "Is that Cheyenne?" she asked, pointing. Matthew followed her gaze and nodded. "The edge of it, yes. We'll skirt around to the east side and enter the city after dark." They continued riding as twilight deepened into night, eventually joining a proper road that led into the eastern part of Cheyenne. Faith had never seen a city before, and even at night, she was overwhelmed by the number of buildings, the width of the streets, and the presence of so many people despite the late hour. Matthew led them to a small, unassuming livery stable on a side street. "We'll leave the horses here," he explained as he dismounted. "The owner's an old friend of my father's. He'll ask no questions." After arranging for the care of their horses, Matthew led Faith through back streets toward the center of town. They stopped a block away from a well-lit, 3-story building with a sign proclaiming it the Cheyenne Hotel. "That's where the judge is staying," Matthew said quietly, "but we can't go in looking like this." He gestured to their travel-worn appearance. "We need to find somewhere to clean up, get you a proper dress." Faith looked down at her dusty clothes and nodded. "Where?" Matthew thought for a moment. "There's a boarding house a few streets over. The woman who runs it, Mrs. Donnelly, she's a widow with a kind heart. She might help us." Faith followed Matthew through the dark streets until they reached a modest 2-story house with a sign that read Donnelly Boarding House. A light still burned in the front window despite the late hour. Matthew knocked softly, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal an older woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes. She squinted at them for a moment before recognition dawned on her face. "Matthew Collins, is that you, boy?" Matthew nodded, removing his hat. "Yes, madam." "Sorry to disturb you so late." Mrs. Donnelly's gaze shifted to Faith, taking in her dusty clothes and tired face. Her expression softened further. "You both look like you've had a hard journey. Come in, come in." Once inside, with the door firmly closed, Matthew quickly explained their situation, or a version of it. He told Mrs. Donnelly that Faith needed to speak with Judge Hamilton about injustices committed by the Blackwood family, but omitted the part about Faith being wanted for murder. The older woman listened without interruption, then nodded decisively. "The judge is a good man, fair. If anyone will listen, it's him." She turned to Faith with a motherly smile. "Let's get you cleaned up, dear. I think my daughter left some dresses that might fit you." An hour later, Faith emerged from Mrs. Donnelly's guest room transformed. She wore a modest but pretty blue dress that fit her surprisingly well, and her hair was neatly arranged in a simple updo. Mrs. Donnelly had even found a pair of shoes to replace Faith's worn boots. Matthew, who had also been given an opportunity to clean up and change into borrowed clothes, stared at her with undisguised admiration. "You look beautiful," he said softly. Faith blushed, smoothing the unfamiliar fabric of the dress. "Thank you." Mrs. Donnelly watched them with a knowing smile. "Now, you two best get some rest. I'll arrange a meeting with Judge Hamilton for tomorrow morning. He takes breakfast in the hotel dining room at 8 o'clock sharp. I serve his favorite apple pie at my boarding house, so he'll see me if I ask." Faith felt a surge of gratitude toward this kind woman who was helping them without question. "How can we ever thank you?" Mrs. Donnelly patted her cheek. "You just hold your head high tomorrow and tell the truth, child. That's thanks enough for me." She turned to Matthew. "You can take the room at the end of the hall. The young lady will stay in my daughter's old room." Matthew nodded his thanks, then hesitated. "Mrs. Donnelly, if anyone comes asking about us, I haven't seen hide nor hair of you," she finished firmly. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow will be a big day." Faith slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with faceless pursuers and courtrooms where everyone wore Sheriff Blackwood's face. She rose with the dawn, her stomach too knotted with anxiety to consider breakfast despite Mrs. Donnelly's gentle urging. Matthew looked equally tense when he joined them in the small parlor, though he managed a reassuring smile for Faith. "Ready?" he asked. Faith nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked the short distance to the Cheyenne Hotel, Mrs. Donnelly leading the way with the confidence of a woman on a mission. The hotel dining room was elegant but not ostentatious, with white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. Several well-dressed men and women were already enjoying their breakfast. Mrs. Donnelly scanned the room, then nodded toward a distinguished-looking gentleman sitting alone by the window. "That's Judge Hamilton," she whispered. "Let me speak to him first." Faith and Matthew waited anxiously as Mrs. Donnelly approached the judge's table. They watched as she spoke, gesturing subtly in their direction. The judge looked over, his expression curious but not unwelcoming. After a brief conversation, Mrs. Donnelly waved them over. "Judge Hamilton," she said as they approached, "may I present Miss Faith Warren and Mr. Matthew Collins?" The judge stood, offering a polite bow. "Mrs. Donnelly says you have a matter of some urgency to discuss. Please join me." Faith's heart pounded as she took the offered seat. Up close, Judge Hamilton was less intimidating than she'd feared, a man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed gray beard. "Thank you for seeing us, Your Honor," Matthew began. "Perhaps we should speak privately," the judge suggested, glancing around the crowded dining room. "My suite upstairs would be more appropriate for what I gather is a sensitive matter." They followed Judge Hamilton to his suite on the third floor, a comfortable sitting room with adjoining bedroom. Once the door was closed, the judge turned to them expectantly. "Now, what's this about the Blackwoods that couldn't wait for my scheduled visit to Preston?" Faith took a deep breath and began her story, the truth, all of it. She told the judge about her father refusing to sell their ranch, about Edward Blackwood and his men arriving that fateful day, about watching helplessly as they murdered her father in cold blood. Her voice broke when she described grabbing the shotgun and firing, but she forced herself to continue, explaining her flight and how Matthew had found her. Matthew then shared his own story, his parents' suspicious death, the pattern of intimidation and violence the Blackwoods had used to expand their holdings, and the complicity of Sheriff Blackwood in covering up his family's crimes. Judge Hamilton listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, considering. "These are serious allegations," he finally said. "Do you have any evidence beyond your testimony?" Faith's heart sank. "No, Your Honor. It was just me, Edward, and his men, and they're saying I murdered him unprovoked." "I may have something," Matthew said suddenly. Both Faith and the judge looked at him in surprise. "Letters. My father kept records of the threats, the accidents. Documented everything in case something happened to him." His expression turned pained. "After he died, I continued his records. Names, dates, details of what the Blackwoods have done to at least a dozen families in the territory." Judge Hamilton leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Where are these records?" "Hidden at my ranch," Matthew replied, "in a lockbox beneath the floorboards." "And can others corroborate these accounts?" the judge pressed. Matthew nodded firmly. "Yes, Tom Henderson, the Jacobsons, the Reeves family, they've all suffered at the Blackwoods' hands. They'd testify if given protection." Judge Hamilton stroked his beard thoughtfully. "This isn't a simple matter to resolve. Sheriff Blackwood has issued a warrant for Miss Warren's arrest. The law must be followed, even when those enforcing it may be corrupt." Faith's hope began to crumble, but the judge continued. "However, I cannot ignore such serious allegations against a public official. This requires a formal investigation." He fixed Faith with a stern but not unkind gaze. "Miss Warren, I cannot simply dismiss the charges against you. There must be a proper legal process." "She'll hang if she's arrested," Matthew protested, his voice tight with fear. "Sheriff Blackwood won't let her live long enough to stand trial." Judge Hamilton held up a placating hand. I understand your concern, Mr. Collins. Which is why I propose a compromise. He turned back to Faith. You will remain in protective custody, not a jail cell, but somewhere secure while I gather evidence and testimonies. If what you've told me is substantiated, I will use my authority to dismiss the charges and initiate proceedings against Sheriff Blackwood instead. Faith exchanged a look with Matthew, hope and fear warring within her. Protective custody, where, Your Honor? Here in Cheyenne, under the supervision of the Federal Marshal's Office, the judge replied. Beyond Sheriff Blackwood's jurisdiction. And what about Matthew? Faith asked. If he returns to his ranch for those records, the Blackwoods might, Mr. Collins will have an escort, Judge Hamilton assured her. 2 deputy marshals should provide adequate protection. Matthew nodded slowly. When do we start? Immediately, the judge said, rising. I'll send for Marshal Dawson now. Miss Warren will be taken to a safe location while Mr. Collins and the deputies can prepare to depart for his ranch. He paused, his expression softening slightly. I want you both to understand what you're doing takes courage. Standing up to men like the Blackwoods isn't easy, but it's necessary if justice is to prevail. As Judge Hamilton left to make the arrangements, Faith turned to Matthew, suddenly afraid this might be their last moment alone together for some time. I can't thank you enough, she said softly. You've risked everything for me. Matthew took her hands in his expression intense. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Faith felt tears threatening. I'm scared, Matthew. What if something happens to you on the way back to the ranch? Nothing will happen, he promised. I'll get those records, bring them back, and before you know it, this will all be over. He squeezed her hands gently, and then maybe we can think about the future. The future? Faith echoed, her heart beating faster. Matthew nodded, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. I was hoping, I thought perhaps you might consider staying at the ranch with me. Faith stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. Are you asking me to? Not yet, Matthew interrupted quickly. That is, not properly. Not until this is all behind us and you're truly free to choose. His voice softened, but I want you to know that's what I hope for. A future together. Before Faith could respond, the door opened as Judge Hamilton returned with a stern-looking man in a marshal's uniform. The moment for private conversation was over, but the unspoken promise in Matthew's eyes gave Faith strength as they were separated, she to a small but comfortable room in the marshal's office, and Matthew to prepare for the journey back to his ranch. That night, alone in her temporary quarters, Faith thought about Matthew's words, a future together. Despite the uncertainty that still surrounded her, the idea filled her with a warm hope she hadn't dared feel since before her father's death. She fell asleep thinking of Matthew's ranch not as a hiding place, but as a home they might share. The next 3 days passed with excruciating slowness. Faith was treated well, but had little to do besides read the books Marshal Dawson's wife kindly brought her. She worried constantly about Matthew, imagining all manner of disasters that might have befallen him and the deputies on their journey. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Marshal Dawson himself came to her room, his expression unreadable. Miss Warren, he said, Judge Hamilton would like to see you. Faith's heart leapt to her throat. Is it Matthew? Has something happened? The judge will explain everything, Marshal Dawson replied, neither confirming nor denying her fears. With trembling hands, Faith smoothed her borrowed dress and followed the marshal to Judge Hamilton's chambers in the courthouse. When the door opened, the first person she saw was Matthew, looking tired but unharmed, and relief flooded through her so powerfully that she nearly staggered. Without thinking, she rushed to him, and his arms came around her in a fierce embrace. You're all right, she breathed against his chest. I told you I'd come back, Matthew murmured into her hair. A discreet cough reminded them they weren't alone. Faith pulled back reluctantly, her cheeks flushing as she turned to face Judge Hamilton, who was watching them with an expression that might have been amusement beneath his judicial gravity. Miss Warren, please be seated, the judge said, gesturing to the chairs before his desk. Mr. Collins has brought back some most illuminating documents. On the desk lay Matthew's father's journal and a stack of letters, all neatly arranged. The judge indicated them with a wave of his hand. These records, along with sworn statements I've collected from other victims of the Blackwood's intimidation, paint a disturbing picture of corruption and criminality stretching back nearly a decade. Judge Hamilton's expression was stern. Based on this evidence, I have issued warrants for the arrest of Sheriff James Blackwood and several of his deputies on charges of corruption, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. Faith could hardly believe what she was hearing. And what about the charges against me? Dismissed, the judge said firmly. Your actions, while regrettable, were clearly self-defense following the murder of your father. No charges will be pursued. Tears of relief sprang to Faith's eyes. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Judge Hamilton cautioned. Sheriff Blackwood won't go quietly. Federal marshals are on their way to Preston to execute the warrants, but there may be resistance. Until he's in custody, you both should remain here in Cheyenne where it's safe. Matthew nodded his agreement. How long do you think that will be? A week, perhaps 2, the judge replied. In the meantime, I suggest you both consider your future plans. Miss Warren, your father's property may be recoverable, though I understand it was damaged. Faith thought of the ranch where she'd grown up, the house now burned, the land tainted by terrible memories. I'm not sure I want to go back there, she admitted softly. Judge Hamilton nodded understandingly. Then perhaps Mr. Collins' generous offer might be worth considering. At Faith's questioning look, he added with the hint of a smile, he mentioned certain hopes while we were reviewing the evidence. Faith turned to Matthew, who looked both embarrassed and determined. I was going to wait for a more appropriate moment, he said, casting a slightly exasperated glance at the judge. But since his honor has broached the subject. To Faith's astonishment, Matthew slid from his chair to one knee before her, taking her hands in his. Faith Warren, these past weeks have shown me what my life was missing. You brought warmth and light back to my home and to my heart. His voice grew husky with emotion. I know this is sudden, and I'll understand if you need time, but I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Faith stared at him, her heart so full she could scarcely breathe. In the short time they'd known each other, they had faced danger, shared grief, and found unexpected joy. It wasn't a conventional courtship, but nothing about their story had been conventional. Yes, she whispered, squeezing his hands. Yes, Matthew Collins, I'll marry you. The smile that lit Matthew's face was like sunrise after the darkest night. He rose and pulled her gently to her feet, then kissed her their first real kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. Faith melted into his embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time since her world had shattered. Another discreet cough from Judge Hamilton finally separated them. The judge was smiling broadly now, judicial dignity momentarily set aside. Well, he said warmly, it seems I'll be performing another service before returning to my circuit. Would you like to be married here in Cheyenne before you return home? Faith and Matthew exchanged a look of surprised delight. Yes, Your Honor, Matthew answered for both of them. We would be honored. 3 days later, in the small chapel adjacent to the courthouse, Faith Warren became Faith Collins in a simple but beautiful ceremony. Mrs. Donnelly had helped Faith find a suitable white dress, and the boarding house owner wept openly as Judge Hamilton pronounced them husband and wife. Marshal Dawson and his wife served as witnesses, along with the 2 deputies who had accompanied Matthew to retrieve the evidence. As Matthew kissed his bride, Faith felt the last broken pieces of her heart mend. The shadow of the Blackwoods still loomed. News had come that the sheriff had fled before the marshals arrived, though 2 of his deputies had been captured. But in this moment, surrounded by new friends and clasped in her husband's arms, Faith allowed herself to believe in the future they would build together. 1 week later, with Sheriff Blackwood still at large but the territory officially declared safe for their return, Faith and Matthew made the journey back to the ranch that would now be their home. They traveled openly on the main roads this time, no longer fugitives but a legally wed couple returning to their property. As they crested the final ridge and Matthew's small ranch came into view, Faith felt a surge of emotion. The modest cabin, the barn, the corrals, all of it represented not just shelter but a new beginning. She glanced at Matthew, who was watching her face with tender expectation. "Welcome home, Mrs. Collins," he said softly. Faith smiled, her heart full to bursting. "Home," she repeated, savoring the word. "I like the sound of that." Matthew urged his horse forward, and Faith followed, riding beside him rather than behind, partners in this new life they were beginning together. As they approached the cabin, Faith was surprised to see smoke rising from the chimney. "Did you leave a fire burning?" she asked, concerned. Matthew shook his head, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "No, someone's there." They approached cautiously, but before they reached the yard, the cabin door opened and Tom Henderson stepped out, waving cheerfully. "About time you two got back," he called. "Martha's been keeping the place up, but she's itching to get back to her own kitchen." Relief washed over Faith as Martha Henderson appeared in the doorway behind her husband, wiping her hands on her apron. Come in," Martha called. "I've got stew on and biscuits in the oven. Figured you'd be hungry after your journey." Matthew dismounted and helped Faith down from her horse, both of them grinning at this unexpected welcome. "Mrs. Henderson, you didn't have to go to all this trouble," Faith said as they approached. Martha waved away her words. "Nonsense. It's not every day our confirmed bachelor neighbor comes home with a bride. Besides," she added with a knowing smile, "we've been eager to meet Matthew's cousin properly." Faith blushed, realizing the Hendersons had known the truth all along but had kept their secret. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything." Inside, the cabin was spotlessly clean, with fresh curtains at the windows and wildflowers on the table. Faith felt a rush of gratitude for these neighbors who had prepared such a welcome. Over the hearty meal, the Hendersons shared the news from Preston. The two captured deputies had confessed to numerous crimes, implicating Sheriff Blackwood and others in the process. A new sheriff had been appointed temporarily, with elections to be held in the fall. And Edward Blackwood's men. Faith asked hesitantly, "The ones who were with him when?" "Caught trying to flee the territory," Tom Henderson said with satisfaction. "They'll stand trial for your father's murder, among other charges." "And Sheriff Blackwood," Matthew pressed. Tom's expression darkened. "Still no sign of him." "The marshals think he might have headed for the Dakota territory, but they're still searching." Faith felt a chill at the thought of James Blackwood still free, possibly plotting revenge. Matthew seemed to sense her unease and took her hand beneath the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "If he's smart, he'll stay gone," Tom continued. "Too many people are willing to testify now that Judge Hamilton's broken the dam of silence. The Blackwood reign is over, whether they catch him or not." Faith wanted to believe that was true. She smiled and turned the conversation to happier topics, asking Martha about her garden and the upcoming harvest festival in Preston. After the Hendersons left with promises to visit again soon, Faith and Matthew stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching the sun set over the rolling Wyoming landscape. Matthew's arm was around her waist, holding her close against his side. "Are you happy, Faith?" he asked softly. Faith leaned her head against his shoulder. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again," she answered truthfully, "though I'll feel better when they catch Sheriff Blackwood." Matthew pressed a kiss to her temple. "They will, and even if they don't, we won't live in fear. We've faced the worst and survived, together." Faith turned in his arms, raising her face to his. "Together," she agreed, before his lips met hers in a kiss that promised all the tomorrows they would share in the months that followed. Faith and Matthew built the life they had envisioned. The ranch thrived under their joint care, Matthew teaching Faith everything he knew about raising cattle, while Faith expanded the garden and added chickens to their small menagerie. They worked side by side, equal partners in their shared enterprise. News eventually came that James Blackwood had been captured in Montana territory and would stand trial for his crimes. Faith testified at the trial, her voice steady as she recounted her father's murder and her own actions afterward. With Matthew beside her and the support of others who had suffered under the Blackwoods' tyranny, she found the strength to face her past and help ensure justice was served. James Blackwood was convicted and sentenced to prison. marking the final end of his family's corrupt empire. The lands they had stolen were returned to their rightful owners when possible, including the Warren Ranch. Faith chose to sell her father's property, using the money to expand her and Matthew's holdings and to establish a small fund to help other families who had been victims of the Blackwoods. By their first anniversary, Faith was expecting their first child. As she stood with Matthew on their porch, his hands gently cradling her growing belly, she marveled at how much had changed in just 2 years. From the broken girl hiding beside a creek, terrified and alone, to this a woman loved, a wife, soon to be a mother with a home and future secure. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, his breath warm against her hair. Faith smiled, covering his hands with her own. "About the day you found me, how close I came to sending you away." Matthew turned her gently in his arms. "I wouldn't have gone," he admitted. "Not once I saw you. Something told me you were meant to be here with me, even blood-stained and crying," Faith teased. "Especially then," Matthew said seriously. "You were broken but not beaten. I knew you were strong enough to heal." His eyes, so full of love, met hers. "I just wanted to give you a safe place to do it." Faith raised a hand to his cheek, overwhelmed with gratitude and love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "You gave me so much more than safety," she whispered. "You gave me a home, a family, a future." As the setting sun painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the same colors that had adorned the heavens the first evening, they had sat together on this porch. Matthew kissed his wife with all the fierce resolve that had first driven him to bring home a broken girl he'd found crying beside a creek. "And we're just getting started," he promised against her lips, as their child kicked beneath their joined hands a new life, a new chapter in their story, beginning in the place where they had found each other and healed together. The sound of laughter drifted from the cabin into the vast openness of the Wyoming territory, a sound that would multiply and echo through the years, as their family grew and thrived on the land. They had claimed not just with legal rights, but with love, courage, and the unbreakable bond of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to become whole again.